rolling.
Okay, so you'll look at me and try not to look at
Yes.
the camera.
Look, everything we do requires energy. This is because of the kind of planet we live on. You know, the Earth attracts us anywhere where we go. And to move objects, you know, we have to overcome the force of gravity. Then we have to move and collect food and run and do things like that. And the primitive man in the forest, he got the energy from what he ate. And the amount was not very large. You know, the amount of food that you need to keep alive is approximately the energy that is contained in a cup of oil. 1 cup of oil, 2,000 kilocalories. You know, that's the number. People know that, you know, because if you eat more than 2,000 calories per day, you get fat. And if you eat a lot less, you know, you get thinner and eventually you will die. But that was the primitive man. Today, the average person in the United States or in Sao Paulo consumes 100 times that energy. And most of that energy comes from fossil fuels. So the problem is not the energy we are consuming, because there is plenty of energy on Earth which comes from the sun. The problem is that we got addicted to oil, gas, and coal. And these three sources of energy, which are the fossil fuels, are the problem, because they are not, they will not last forever. That's the first thing. They are hard to get. Most of the stuff you have to get from the Middle East, which is a complicated part of the world. And the environmental problems that we are facing come mostly from the use of fossil fuels. So and that's the problem we have to solve, you know. We are changing the climate. We are ruining the air in the cities, not only in Sao Paulo, you know, but in London, Los Angeles, Beijing, you know, have quality of air in cities which is not very good. So the ways to solve the problem, there are two ways. You know, one, you change your habits. You know, you consume less, you become more careful, and there is a current of people, a number of people that propose that. Basically, they are telling us that we should be more virtuous, you know, we should consume less energy. I think that's very difficult, you know. People have been trying to do that for hundreds of years, you know. It's very difficult to change human nature, you know. The Chinese want to get rich like the Americans do, you know. So the only solution that remains is switch to renewable energy sources. That is, energies that come from the sun, because the sun throws over the earth an enormous amount of energy, enough to supply all of our needs forever, because the sun is going to last forever. Well, maybe not forever, but 4 billion years, you know, which is a lot compared to the half-life of people, you know. And people are trying, you know, and some of them have success, some of them have not. And in some places, in the United States or in Spain or in Germany, people use windmills. And a lot of windmills are getting into the system, you know. And they replace coal or oil or gas. And in Brazil, we are fortunate because we produce a fuel that is a very good replacement for gasoline. And we did it, and we are eliminating gasoline from the Brazilian system of transportation. We have not succeeded entirely, but we did eliminate 1/2 of the gasoline that would be used otherwise.
Yeah, 1 second. Can you guys deal with the I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that everything
Okay.
you're saying is.
So Alex, that's the general,
That's the big picture.
the big picture. Did I address your concerns on a big picture way?
Yeah, and one thing that you said that I think is really interesting, you were mentioning this issue of fossil fuels, and I was wondering if we could just go back to when you really started pushing for a biofuel program in Brazil. Maybe you could tell us the story about that, and then also, was that motivated by seeing the problems created by fossil fuels, or what brought you to really, that was a lot of work to take on to initiate that program?
Look, in 1973, Brazil was completely dependent on oil imports. Very little oil was produced inside Brazil, which is still the situation in many countries in the world today. And we had to pay for oil. In the United States, you have a situation which is not dissimilar to that. You know, you are importing today more than one half of the oil that you consume. You know, the United States is spending per day $1 billion in money paying for the oil that is converted in these magnificent buildings in Dubai or other places in the Middle East. And this is the situation Brazil was facing in 1973. And we were spending in oil imports about 15% of what we exported. So that was not too much. You know, it was tolerable. And there are countries in the world that are still facing a situation like that. With the oil crisis in 73, suddenly the import bill was multiplied by 4. And suddenly, in a matter of weeks, Brazil was spending in oil imports almost one half of all the proceedings of the exports that we were able to sell abroad. So we were facing immediately a situation which really is equivalent to complete bankruptcy. And then people pointed out, you know, technical people pointed out that why don't we use ethanol? You know, in the beginning of the oil age, of the automobile age, in 1900, Henry Ford considered seriously using ethanol, alcohol, to run automobiles, and other people too. That did not went very far, because gasoline became very cheap at that time. Therefore, and of course, booze. This was really booze. You know, was ethanol. You could drink it. You know, it was expensive, so the idea was abandoned. But in 1973, when this situation hit Brazil, people reminded all these ideas and said, look, Brazil is a large producer of sugar from sugarcane. And from sugarcane, you can produce either sugar or ethanol for drinks. You know, I mean, since we are in Brazil, cachaça and caipirinhas are made up of ethanol. And people realized immediately that they could mix ethanol in the gasoline and replace not all of the gasoline, but part of the gasoline. And the government adopted that idea. It took some regulations to do that. You know, it's not something that happens by itself. You know, and government regulation was needed. So government decided that initially one would mix 10% of ethanol in the gasoline. You know, after 1 year, 15%, then 20%, and so on. Then there was a question of price too. They had to adjust prices accordingly. So it was not at that time a free market move. It was a move that required government intervention, because ethanol was more expensive than gasoline. But then something quite interesting happened. People then noticed that. And one of the persons that noticed that was me. You know, I was a university professor. I still am a university professor. I had no interest whatsoever in making money out of ethanol, you know, but I was watching what was happening. And I noticed two things. First, the more ethanol you produce, the more the price drops, which is not unusual, you know. If you produce very few cars, very few automobiles, one by one, they're very expensive. If you produce automobiles by the hundreds or thousands, like Henry Ford did in the United States, introducing mass production methods, the price drops. This is what happened in the United States 100 years ago. So I pointed out that although the cost of gasoline, of ethanol, was a little higher than gasoline, as production grew, the price was bound to fall down. And it did. That was the first thing. Second, I pointed out that ethanol, as a replacement of gasoline, was a renewable source of energy. It was not a fossil fuel because it came from a tree, which is sugarcane, which grows in the fields like potatoes or wheat. It grows every year. You know, it grows, you cut it, you cut the sugarcane, you take it to a factory, you produce ethanol, then next year the sugarcane grows again. And what makes the sugarcane grow is the light from the sun. So it's a renewable source of energy. It's sun's energy. You know, it's like converting the lighting, the energy from the sun into a liquid. That required a calculation. You know, people give a fancy name to that. It's a life cycle analysis, you know. You make a calculation to see what are the inputs into the production. Then I found out that it was a very good bet. You know, it was a renewable source of energy. So people immediately became quite enthused by that, and the production grew. And then it replaced then 25% of the gasoline in the country. You can do that today in the United States. The changes you have to do in the motor are really very small. You know, they are not very, very significant. But you cannot go above 25%, which is a problem. And people solved that problem. They redesigned the motor. You know, so there were special motors for ethanol. Then you can use 100%. In the United States, there are cars that do that. They use 85% ethanol. There's a technical reason for that, which is, I don't think it's worth going into that. So in 1985, approximately, there were two types of cars in Brazil. And when you purchase an automobile, you made your choice. You purchase a regular car in which gasoline with 25% of ethanol was the fuel, or you purchase a car which is pure ethanol. In the service stations, you had two pumps. So you drive into a station and you ask what you want. That kept going for a while, but then there was a technological development in the year 2003, which is a wonderful technical development. People realized that if you put some chips, you know, a very primitive computer in your car adjusts to the fuel that you use. They are called flex fuel cars. Then you don't have to worry anymore. You put either ethanol or gasoline, and you can use any mixture. And the computer, it's a very small computer, adjusts the sparks in the engine to the fuel that we are using. And today, more than 90% of the cars that are purchased every year in Brazil are flex fuel cars. So in a few years, the old cars are going to get out of circulation, and we are going to have a fleet of flex fuels.
Can you talk about some of the market forces at play? Because I think like the flex fuel technology is really amazing in terms of mitigating some of the problems of a sugar shortage or an oil shortage. And Brazil kind of ended up being a guinea pig for some of those problems, because I know in the 80s you had low oil prices and less ethanol production. Right. And then if I bought an ethanol-only car, I had trouble, and I think Brazil even imported some ethanol at that time. So can you sort of explain what those pressures are on the two different types of fuel, and then how you guys have created a system that makes the fuels competitive instead of problematic?
Yes. The problems we faced in 1985 were serious indeed, you know, because as I mentioned, we had two types of cars. One car running on a mixture of gasoline and ethanol, and another one running on ethanol. Then what happened in the mid-80s is that the price of oil went down after the oil crisis. So people did not want to buy ethanol, pure ethanol anymore. And then there were shortages of ethanol. Since the price went down, people did not purchase ethanol. The producers of ethanol did not want to produce it. They were losing money. And it was a problem then of a very, very serious crisis of disappearance of the preference for pure ethanol cars. What sustained the program for a few years was the fact that in Brazil, there's no gasoline anymore. If you want to buy a gallon of gasoline, you will not find it. You will only find it in a refinery. In any service station in Brazil, gasoline comes with a mixture of 25% of ethanol. And this is what sustained the program. But you are right, the program almost died in the mid-80s because of these fluctuations. And what solved the problem, and then it solved completely, are the flex fuel cars, which now exist anywhere, including the United States. And therefore, the idea that you need very special service stations and all that and so on is incorrect. You have a flex fuel car. If you find gasoline, you use gasoline. If you don't find gasoline and find ethanol, you use ethanol. And then market prices dominate your choice. You have your choice, which did put a lot of pressure on the producers, because in the old days, in 73, 75, 78, the producers of ethanol could overcharge on ethanol because there is no competition. If you had a car running on ethanol and the price went up, what could you do? Now they cannot do it anymore. If the producers of ethanol decide to boost the price of ethanol, people will switch to gasoline. And so the intervention of the government was needed in the beginning. And the question is asked frequently is, how do you do it? At that time we had a military government. And then people make these, sort of patronizing jokes, that it could only happen with a military government. It's not true. The United States Congress passed a law requiring a mixture of ethanol in gasoline. And there's a timetable for that, Every year the amount changes and so on and so forth. And that decision was taken by the Congress of the United States. So it's not a decision taken on the basis of authority. It's the realization that we have to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels and switch to renewable energy sources. And that's one of the methods of doing it.